Prison Days, Book 7. Written by Simon King. Narrated by Todd Waites. Introduction. Welcome to yet another trip through maximum security. This marks the 7th installment since I began this crazy journey, and things have only gotten more shocking by the day. Although I have had a significant change, which I hope will share another unique side to this existence, rest assured that nothing has changed with the real stars of this show, the inmates. As part of a rotational requirement, each officer is offered the option of where they would like to work around the prison. It gives everyone the chance to try their hand at something different, maybe even positions they may not have thought of before. For me, I decided to make a change into night shift, definitely a different side of the prison, as I quickly experienced. If you thought days were mad, wait until you see what I have in store for you this time around. While you might assume that being December brings a certain sense of joy to the place, guess again. Christmas time brings its own unique challenges, and for very good reason. For one, there's a sense of dread in the air, especially amongst those who know they have no chance of going home for the holidays. For others, it seems to bring a certain influence that pushes people to the edge of breaking point. Incidents leading to verbal abuse and assaults go up in December, and that's why it pays to exercise a lot of extra caution. Think of a tinderbox with a substantial number of sparks ready to explode walking around. You may be thinking that there must be some kind of celebration, despite being in prison, and you would be correct. Officers try and spread the cheer, put up small Christmas trees, and in some of the specialist units, introduce festive activities for mentally challenged prisoners. But it may be that the decorations simply add to the pain of being caught in such a place, something highly probable. A lot of prisoners don't tend to share how they really feel, especially when it comes to officers. They put on their bravest face and continue wearing that front, that tough exterior they want the outside world to see, with any emotion seen as a weakness, a dirty word behind the walls. But let's cut through the chase and get to where you really want to go. It's time to unlock the gates, watch our backs, and head inside to see what else could possibly happen in maximum security. Monday, December 3rd. My first official shift as a new night shift officer, and I'm kind of excited. I know I've completed plenty of night shifts in the past, but for some weird reason, it just feels different. The whole prison feels different to a certain degree, with faces walking the other way as I head inside. It's not something you can really put your finger on, but rather just a kind of vibe. I head straight to the duty supervisor's office to get a feel for what the early evening has in store. This is the point where you find out your unit allocation, as well as which officer you will partner with for the duration of your shift. For some, it can be a very nervous time. Ending up partnered with someone you don't like can often lead to a very long night. Whilst the prison has a certain number of units, not all are manned during the night. There's no need to, as the intercom systems installed throughout the majority of the prison cells link straight back to the control room after evening lockdown. Those units that are manned normally serve a more specific purpose, like prisoners on suicide watch, medical conditions, or management prisoners. The duty supervisor this evening is an old hand named Eugene Turner. He's one of those officers that much prefers the nights and tends to swap a lot of shifts with other supervisors who'd rather remain on day shift for personal reasons, like family commitments. I've often heard whispers from other officers that nights are the perfect place to hide, as the majority of prisoners remain locked up for the entirety of the shift. Whatever his reasons for remaining on nights, I don't mind him. He's never done wrong by me and speaks to me with the same respect I show others, and that's good enough for me. I tend to try and keep my distance from people who love to whisper behind people's backs, only too aware that I'm probably one of their whisper's subjects when not around. "Hey, Simon," Eugene says as he looks up and sees me checking out the duty allocations. "Got you looking after the boners, if that's all right." I nod, not fussed with my allocation. There's a total of 6 protection units, and I have the pleasure of looking after 3 of them this night, together with my partner, a lady named Rosita. Rosita, or Rose as we call her, is a casual officer who works whenever there's a need for her. I haven't seen her in several months, and I'm happy to join her for the night. I head for the staff room and stow my gear. It's still a good 30 minutes before my official start time, which gives me enough time to store my bag, put my food in the fridge, and check emails. The staff room is still mostly deserted, save for a couple of officers nearing the end of their shift, simply waiting for the clock to strike the moment of the day's end. Once my gear is packed away and I see the only computer in the staff room already used, I decide to head back to the admissions area, the only place in the prison that will still operate after lockdown. And that's because they will continue to receive incoming prisoners, either from other prisons or those returning from court. With the prison locked down, it will be up to the night patrol staff to return the prisoners back to their units. As soon as I unlock the door and swing it open, I already hear the hustle and bustle of an area rife with activity. Even before making my way through the door, I'm confronted by several inmates coming towards me. "Let us through, boss," one of them asks. They're in a rush, and for very good reason. As soon as the call to halt all prisoner movement comes across the radio, whichever inmates remain in admissions will need to be escorted back to their units by escorting staff, like myself. The process can take a while, especially if an unexpected code is also called. I hold the door open and wave them through, then watch as they peel off towards various gates. The officers out in the control yard check IDs, then unlock gates and let the prisoners through into their assigned yards. For me, the more prisoners I can help process and push out the door will mean less work after lockdown. I don't bother with the meet and greets, simply sliding in and joining the ranks already processing. A couple of officers stand behind a counter and continuously open and close prisoner tubs, pulling out prison uniforms and throwing back in their civilian clothing. These are all court returns, with most attending simple hearings and mentions. Several are voicing their opinions on the speed of the processing, themselves rushing so they don't get caught. "How many to go?" I ask, as I step in and help with the strip searching. The officer beside me just shakes his head, an indication that things aren't good. "Prison was locked down for almost 3 hours after lunchtime count," an officer behind me says. "What?" I ask. "Yeah, one short during count, who they couldn't find." He hands me a pair of pants and a shirt as I slip on my gloves, then hands me the shoes. "Attempted escape?" I call back as I hand the clothes to the officer behind the counter and wait for the uniform. "Not quite," another answers. "Someone fucked up and forgot to note a discharge down in the unit log." 3 hours? I ask, taking the uniform back to the strip room and handing the clothing to the crook. We let him get dressed and move on to another cubicle, this time me taking the lead. All up, there's maybe half a dozen officers doing strips, with 2 more behind the counter. As I begin the process with the crook before me, I hear someone shout, "Ready for another 6?" It wasn't the final 6, but rather another 6. That meant there were quite a few to go. I take a peek at my watch and see that there's only 5 minutes until control call for movement to cease. As the prisoner pulls his underwear off and tosses them on the chair beside him, I feel a tap on my shoulder. "Hey, do you mind staying here after lockdown and helping out?" It's the supervisor, and I nod. It means a delay in the rest of my own duties, but I don't mind. It will make the night go just a little bit quicker. The prisoner finishes the strip dance by turning around, lifting each foot for me, and finally bending over and spreading his cheeks, giving me a front row seat to viewing his arsehole. With nothing interesting worth noting, I give him the thumbs up and watch as he hurries to dress himself again. Once done, I hand him his ID card movement slip and point him towards the door, before moving on to the next cubicle. I see Rose standing behind the counter, give her a wave and point to me, then her. She understands the gesture and nods, acknowledging our partnering for the shift. The next crook I see immediately grabs my attention. His demeanor is completely different to the rest, moving slow and showing disinterest in hurrying. He has a depressed expression and almost appears as if he's been crying. He's fairly young, maybe early 20s, and I ask him to hand me his clothes. He does, and as he starts to take his shirt off, I ask, "You okay?" He nods, but I see he's visibly far from okay. I continue the process, and just as he's finished, hear the radios around me come to life. The echoes of control calling for movement to cease, drowned out by a uniform groan from the crooks and officers alike. "How many's left?" someone asks. About 20, is answer enough for me to understand that I'm here for a good hour at least. Once the prisoner is dressed, I take him through to a separate cell. As he walks in, he pauses and turns to me. "I'm not a boner," he says, and I nod. "I know, but we separate you into units ready for escorting once count's called correct." He nods at my lie, and I wait for him to enter the cell and take a seat, the same depressed look remaining on his face. Once the door is closed, I head for the book, the officer manning the front desk of admissions, usually in the know. He's on the phone, and I wait for him to finish, no doubt confirming numbers with control before the commencement of the muster. "What's the story with Timothy West?" I finally ask George, after a brief howdy-do. "That the young guy with the neck tattoo?" I nod. "Got sentenced today. 10 years. "Ouch," I reply. "He wasn't looking too good, so I chucked him in cell 10. Might get the psych nurse to have a word with him before taking him back." He nods before turning his attention back to the book. Every officer has a duty of care to perform, and when you see something as obvious as what the prisoner was displaying, it's best to report it to those that can deal with it. There's no need for me to know what he's in for, although it's usually pointed out through whispers and finger-pointing. "Can you do a count for me?" George calls after me, and I give him a thumbs up. Counts are always conducted in pairs, with one person unlocking each cell, while the other peeks in and counts numbers. I head back to the counter and find Rose, standing idly and waiting for work to resume. "Hey," I call. "Long time no see." She smiles, gives me a hug, and agrees to tag along for a quick count of numbers. Eventually, we make our way around the cells, come up with 32 prisoners, and take the number back to George. Once he's happy he has enough matching counts from other officers, he gives the shout for processing to resume. Only if control call an incorrect count will the processing stop again. We're lucky, and 10 minutes later, control calls count correct, wishes staff a good night, and effectively ends day shift. We continue processing until every last prisoner is stripped and back in uniform. The rest of the night shift crew eventually turn up and begin taking handfuls of prisoners back to units. While some insist on only taking their own unit's prisoners, others are a little more generous, helping out as much as possible. The good thing with night shift is that there's not a lot of work once the searching is finished, not unless there's a code. That, and the following morning's transfers, with the whole process repeating in reverse at the other end of the night. Rose and I began escorting prisoners, taking them by unit lots. It's a simple process, and with prisoners keen to return to their cells, there's not a lot of talk. It makes the job so much easier when their attention is on something else. Once back in the unit, the crooks grab a meal previously left for them by the kitchen billets, then make their way to their cell doors, waiting for us to let them in. It feels good once the cell is locked up again, knowing that with each turn of the key, the number is slowly reducing. "Code Mike, Yara South," suddenly crackles from the radio, and I swear I hear a unified groan from across the prison. We hurriedly lock away the final 2 prisoners, enter all the names into the unit logbook, then make our way to the unit. Although not our assigned task for the evening, we pitch in, just like everyone else, and grab the stretcher as we pass where it is stowed. It's common practice for whoever is closest, and with Rose guiding the front, we quickly wheel it to Yara South's compound gate just as other officers reach it. One of them opens the gate, and we push the stretcher through, then continue along the short path toward the unit's airlock. Several officers are already inside, and we enter the unit as the supervisor arrives. He makes his way up the stairs towards the second tier as we stow the stretcher near the stairs, then gives the go-ahead for the cell to be cracked. It turns out to be chest pains and requires automatic medical attention, regardless if anyone feels it's an attempt to bail the unit. The nurses arrive shortly after and make their way up the stairs. After disappearing into the cell, now holding the prisoner and supervisor, 2 officers stand guard at the door, just in case things kick off. The rest of us wait at the base of the stairs, a few peeling off or some light conversation. I hear the whispers of "faking it" and "bailing" as I take a seat on the stretcher. A few minutes pass as we patiently wait for the nurses to do their thing. The soup's head suddenly pops out from the cell door. "We got a stretcher?" "Stretcher's here," I call back, and he gives thumbs up before disappearing again. There's a collective groan from the peanut gallery as I hop up and wheel the stretcher a little closer to the stairs. There's movement upstairs, and I finally see the prisoner shuffle out onto the top-tier landing. He's not looking good, his face pale and concerned. Slowly descending the stairs one at a time, I soon see the sweat dripping from him, his hands physically shaking. No one speaks as he slides onto the stretcher, and once he's laid back, Rose and I begin to fasten the safety belts around him, one across his chest, one across his waist, and a final one across his lower legs. Without needing instructions, Rose and I begin to wheel the prisoner from the unit, while the rest of the officers follow and quickly split off into various directions. With the code still active, everyone knows that prisoner moves is halted, so if any are still sitting in admissions, they'll remain there for a few moments longer. Rose and I walk the prisoner to the medical unit in silence. He's lying on the stretcher with his eyes shut, his hands still shaking. He doesn't look in great shape, and the medical unit's sole night officer is holding the door open for us. "Waiting Bay 2, she says, pointing towards a corridor that peels off from the main area. We continue wheeling the prisoner through until we reach the waiting room, then park the stretcher beside the new bed. After we unclip the safety belts, the crook sits up and shuffles across onto the new bed. Despite grunting a little, he manages to slide back on the new bed and shuts his eyes again. Rose wheels the empty stretcher out into the hallway and parks it to one side as I take a seat in one of the spare chairs. It's now a waiting game for us, only too aware of what the next hour holds for us. The prisoner needs watching, the nurses probably starting off with an ECG. If that shows up anything, then an ambulance will be called, and only once the prisoner is aboard do we get to return to our previous duties. It's a significant detour, but one that's unavoidable. Rose stands in the doorway and watches as a new nurse comes in and starts with the usual questions and starts feeling and listening her way across the next section of the process. I've seen it happen dozens of times before and wondered just how qualified I would be to conduct this part of the checks, given the amount of times I'd sat through it. The entire process from initial wheel-in to the eventual call for an ambulance takes just over 30 minutes. Rose and I sit patiently as I see the prisoner deteriorate further, His shaking increases, as does his profuse sweating. It takes another 30 minutes for the ambulance officers to arrive with their own stretcher, and with it, another round of checks and assessments. All Rose and I can do is stand by and look on, with the soup occasionally walking past and giving us the thumbs up. Finally, an hour and 10 minutes after wheeling the prisoner into the medical unit, the ambulance doors finally slam shut, the prisoner neatly wrapped up inside, along with an escorting officer assigned from the night shift crew. We don't hang around to watch it leave, instead making a beeline for the soup's office. Eugene is sitting at his desk, busily typing his report up as we enter. He pauses long enough to thank us. "Good job, guys. Admissions is empty, so just start your searches." We nod, and just as we turn to leave, he adds, "Oh, and can you add the library to your list?" In all honesty, it's not what you'd call work. Codes aside, the searching of 3 units and the library will take us under 2 hours. With a 12-hour shift, flanked by maybe a couple of hours' work at either end, it leaves a lot of time in between to do nothing at all. We head towards Loudon South, the closest along the way. Together with Glenelg East and West, our 3 units are located almost directly beside the library, making for a nice simple walk between. We enter Loudon South and are met by the sounds of dozens of televisions, a couple of stereos, and a few conversations being held under cell doors. It's far from being one of the worst units in the prison, with some holding a never-ending smell that always seems to remain in your clothing long after you walk out again. We each glove up and take a different section. Rose points upstairs and begins to climb the stairs, heading up to check the bins. I head for the small unit kitchen and start with the fridge, carefully to check all the little nooks and crannies I know things to be used as hiding spots. I'll go into more details tomorrow night for you, giving you a complete guide to some of the ingenious places crooks find. I always find it intriguing at how well thought out some of the hiding spots are. Tonight, the searches don't reveal anything, with our assigned tasks turning up clean. It means that once we finish the units and the library, there's nothing left to do but head back to the staff room. There's already several people comfortably nestled into the couches, looking prepared for an evening of intense television watching. We join them, and for the next several hours, either fight fatigue or give in for a quick nap. It just depends on the person. With no codes through the night, it makes for a long stretch of movies and coffee. Although tough at some points, I'm grateful when the sun finally breaks across the horizon, signaling the arrival of a new day. The morning routine involves each team assigned a number of prisoners to escort from their cells to admissions for processing into their court clothes and onto the awaiting transports. Rose and I are lucky with only a single prisoner from Glenelg East on our list. Once he's happy sitting in a cell awaiting his turn, Rose and I offer to help out and join some of the regular admission staff load buses. There's only 15 in total, and makes for a relatively easy morning. With nothing but easy sailing, it isn't long before we finally call it a night and make our way through the front when the time comes. I guess you could call it a perfect night, which I know means less excitement for you, but for us is always a shift we appreciate. It's only a matter of time before the craziness returns, and with it, all the unpredictability of the place we work. Tuesday, December 4th. As I walk through the gate for the second of 3 shifts, I feel as if I only walked out a couple of hours before. Familiar faces pass me as I get a sense of déjà vu, walking along the corridor towards the supervisor's office. It doesn't surprise me to find Eugene back in the chair for the night, but when I see Rose's name next to mine, I briefly wonder whether there's a mistake. Rose normally works a shift a month, maybe 2. Being casual, It's not often she's needed. I point at the sheet and Eugene gives me a nod. That's right. She's happy to work a double, so I thought, hell, why break up a good team, right? I nod, then see we have the same unit allocation. Again, happy to oblige. As I pass through the admissions area on my way to the staff room, I find out that there's only 2 prisoners left to come in, meaning there's no repeat of the madness we had the previous night. It's a perfect start to the night, and as long as there's no codes to mess us up, should see another relatively easy shift ahead of us. I find Rose already in the staff room and give her a wave as I walk through the door. Back again? She nods. Eugene asked if I wanted another shift last night. Why the hell not? Perfect attitude, I replied as I put my dinner into the fridge. I was barely back out when the radio crackled in my ear. Code Mike, Murray North. The groan in the room was in almost perfect harmony as several officers rose from their chairs and made their way out towards the gate. Perfect, I said. Get the codes out of the way now so we won't have any later. Rose just giggled a little as we made our way back out. Although our shift hadn't officially started, it was considered polite to help out whenever possible. It's the courteous thing to do, and as we passed through one of the gates, see the stretcher still parked by one of the walls. Patrol 3 and 4 have the stretcher, I called into my radio. Acknowledged, Patrol 3, is the reply a second later, and we continue on up the path, the stretcher now pulled between us. As we pass through a second gate and enter the compound from Murray North, we hear shouting between the crooks and the unit we're headed towards, and the unit immediately off to the left. Goulburn East prisoners are very similar to the ones held in Murray North, the only difference being the time spent in the cell. The burning they're dishing out to each other from behind barred windows is hilarious, and I would have been content to grab a bucket of popcorn, take a seat on the stretcher, and just sit and listen as they hurl their insults back and forth. "What the fuck would you do anyway, you rat?" one called. "Fuck your mother with Wilson's dick," another called back. "You fucking weak dog, Tunza." "Who's a dog, cunt? You're the fucking boner wanting to suck every cunt's dick." On and on, back and forth. Most of the insults nothing more than quick-witted fits of abuse thrown as fast as the brain could make them up. The best part is they mostly ignore us, focusing on each other. Inside the unit, things aren't any different, with several of the crooks yelling abuse under their doors. I see one of my friends and he throws me a wink and a nod. "They're an excited bunch tonight," I yell. Rick nods in reply, the voices echoing throughout the common area. The code is for a crook named Bryce Turner. Whilst being one of the regular code responses, he's nowhere near the level of prisoners like Toby Manning or John Burns. See Prison Days, Inmates, Book 1. But as I learned quickly in maximum security, never underestimate anybody, and according to Rick, Bryce Turner has been on a roll. "Silly prick ate a plastic cup this morning," Rick said as he stepped down from the station. "What?" I asked, not for failing to hear. "Seriously. Nurse gave him his meds through the trap and he took the cup, stared her in the eye, and started taking bites out of it." I don't know whether it was because of the tone he used while telling the story or the story itself, but I laughed quietly into my hand, picturing Bryce as he gave the nurse his vacant stare. He had a significant history for being painful, including numerous stretches in the unit we were standing in, as well as countless suicide watches. He was one of those inmates that loved attention. But while prisoners like Toby Manning and John Burns did it for the attention, thriving off the fuss officers would make whenever they sliced themselves, Bryce was different. He loved to do this shit for one single reason: to make our job as difficult as possible. If he could swallow the batteries from a TV remote control, he'd do it just so we would have to halt what we were doing and call him an ambulance to take him to hospital. The act would take up valuable officer time, sometimes stretching into the hours for those assigned to escort him. "What's he done this time?" I ask. "Just chest pains." He rolls his eyes, and it's not unusual. Half of the unit we were standing in used chest pains as a way of disrupting our shifts repeatedly, or simply to get a nurse into their cell. Everyone knew that as soon as a prisoner called chest pains, officers had to act, regardless if they knew the issue to be fake or not. Imagine the ramifications if an officer ignored a prisoner who claimed to have chest pains and something happened. It was a risk no one was prepared to take. And if you really think about it, why would you? When it came to prisoners using medical conditions as a means to play the game, I had always been told that officers aren't doctors. We weren't trained medical professionals, which meant we simply called those who were to make the determination. I look over and see the supervisor talking through the trap. The voices are quiet compared to the rest of the unit, and things look fairly calm. The two on-duty nurses enter the unit with their trolley and make their way towards Bryce's cell as the soup continues to talk. As I turn to say something else to Rick, an almighty crash reverberates around the unit. Several crooks cheer, and I look over towards Bryce's cell. "Then stay the fuck in there," the soup yells at the door, then turns to the nurses. "He doesn't want to comply. Don't worry about it." The small Asian nurse tries to say something, but the supervisor shakes his head. He won't comply. If he chooses not to, then he misses out on medical attention. He speaks loud enough for the entire unit to hear, probably to justify his action. It's a hard call, but a right one. If a prisoner refuses to comply with simple instructions, which may simply be for them to sit on their bunk, then supervisors have every right to refuse to open the cell door. With civilian staff in the unit, the ramifications of something happening to them is far greater than those from a non-compliant prisoner suffering injuries. The soup steps back a bit and continues talking to the nurse as Rick turns and heads back into the station. "May as well start the report," he mutters. No sooner does he sit down when there's a tap on the door coming from Bryce's cell. When no one comes to the trap fast enough for him, Bryce calls through the door, his words loud enough to be heard by most of the unit. "Boss, I've cut myself." The soup simply looks up to the ceiling, holds his hands out, and shakes his head. There's another tap, and he turns and walks to the cell door. When he opens the trap, it takes him a second to see the damage. "Sit on the bed," he repeats, and this time it appears the prisoner complies, because I see the soup immediately reach for his keys and unlock the door. Before he swings it open, he beckons to a couple of officers before saying, "Watch the blood." As soon as he swings the door open, I see a large spray of it on the inside of the door. While the first two officers step inside the cell, several more, including myself, walk towards the cell just in case he kicks off. When I get close enough to peer inside, I see Bryce sitting on the edge of his bunk, one arm held in the other hand. Blood is dripping onto the floor beneath him, already forming a decent-sized pool. He appears quite pale, and I'm not surprised when he lays back on his bunk. "Think he's nicked an artery," the soup calls over his shoulder, and the nurses immediately push their trolley towards the cell. They don't hesitate and immediately enter, one of them carrying a bag. The rest of the unit quietens. It's nothing new to them, especially from this prisoner. They've seen it all before, and for some, doesn't make for interesting viewing. For many of them, they'd rather this shit happens now as opposed to after midnight. A midnight code simply interrupts their sleep, and that's when tempers flare. The nurses spend a few minutes stemming the blood flow, then affix a temporary bandage to the wound. The soup beckons for the stretcher a moment later, and before anyone has a chance to do anything else, Bryce is lying on his fresh set of wheels being pushed out through the airlock. Rose and I wait a few moments, then escort the nurses back to the medical unit while the rest of the staff return to their previous duties. It's nearing lockdown, and as we walk through the medical unit's airlock, control calls for movement to cease across the prison. With the nurses safely back in their unit, Rose and I return to admissions to sit out the muster and wait for it to be called correct. If any prisoners are waiting for an escort back to the units in our care, we save time by taking them immediately. It's a relief to find the unit almost completely deserted, save for a couple of officers and a single billet. We confirm count to the officer on the book as 1, then head towards our first unit. Just as we enter the yard for Loddon South, Control calls the muster correct, wishes everyone a good night, and signs off for what I hope is a quiet shift. The staff from the unit ahead of us begin to exit through the airlock almost immediately, no doubt already waiting by the door. We pass the 5 officers, wish them a great night, and continue on. The unit is almost completely silent as we make our way through the airlock, save for a faint murmur coming from a quiet television somewhere near the back of the unit. I point towards the kitchen, while Rose nods and heads for the stairs to the second tier. It's great working with someone that knows what they're doing, and I head to the small kitchen to start my searching. There's a definite aroma of spaghetti bolognese hanging heavy in the air, which intensifies as I open the door. The kitchen looks mostly clean, and I immediately begin with the huge fridge, a common place to locate contraband. Hiding shit is what makes crooks so special. They have a very long time on their hands, which they often use to think of new and ingenious ways to hide their stuff. By stuff, I mean drugs, syringes, shivs, alcohol, cigarettes, phones, charging cables, spare batteries, USB drives, tattoo guns, and any other things they might manage to smuggle in. The list is virtually endless, and it helps to keep an open mind, ready for anything, when searching for stuff. I start with the top shelf and grab each milk carton in turn, giving them a shake, before opening them up and peering inside with my trusty torch. It's common to find things either submerged in the milk, if not prone to water damage, like shivs, or wrapped up in a lot of toilet paper and placed into an empty carton. There's maybe a dozen cartons in this fridge, but I know that there's more than 2 dozen in the fridges out in the common area. While the kitchen has been known to hide stuff, it's not as common as out in the rest of the unit. The reason why is because the only prisoners that have access to the kitchen are the kitchen billets, and if anything is found, it's them that are immediately suspected and questioned. None of them would be dumb enough to hide anything in here. 10 minutes later, with not a single trace of contraband found, I prove that fact and make my way back out into the unit after locking the kitchen's door. Rose has started her ground floor search at the other end, thus I start checking the bins. Now, these are normally prime hiding spots, made all the more better if the bins remained full. It's very common for prisoners to hide things in empty butter tubs or milk cartons, then throw them in the bins and hope they'll still be there by morning. With my trusty rubber gloves on, I carefully sift through the small amount of rubbish, paying special attention to closed containers. Once confirming the bag is free of hidden stuff, I lift the rubbish bag out of the bin itself and check underneath, another common hiding spot underneath. 10 minutes later, the bins have all been cleared, and I head to one of the common area fridges, with Rose already half hidden in the other one. The smell hits me as soon as I open the door, the odor of spoilt milk and rotten meat filling my nostrils. It's not fun, but something that has to be done. Finding a shiv in this fridge could save the life of some unfortunate soul. I repeat my process of checking each individual carton of milk, then grab the first of a dozen egg cartons. I open the lid, then carefully pull out each egg and check underneath. Again, it's a great place to hide small things. Crooks simply crack one end of the egg, empty the contents, and then hide their shit inside. Once turned upside down and returned to their cradle, no one would be the wiser staring at a dozen eggs in a packet. I once found a tattoo gun inside an empty eggshell. That's how confident crooks are of their hiding capability. Other places include food containers and loaves of bread, especially frozen ones. It doesn't take much to scoop out a small section of bread, hide your gear inside, then freeze the loaf. Tonight, the fridge is free from contraband, and as I close the door, look over my shoulder to see Rose heading out into the chook pen. That means she's also found nothing, and the rest of the unit is clear. I follow her out, and we begin checking the washing machines and dryers that are housed out here. It's a tedious task with plenty of hiding spots. I dive into the large drum of soap powder, carefully feeling for anything with my pen. The lint filters are next, followed by the rows of mops and buckets. Finally, we check the two large waste bins in the corner. But fortunately, they're both freshly emptied, with the only thing in them the delicious aroma of rotten fruit. It's a glorious end to the first of 3 searches, and Rose gives me a thumbs up, as if to clarify my own thoughts. Both of the subsequent units turn out to be just as non-eventful as Loddon South. We head back to the supervisor's office and fill out our brief nightly report for each unit, enter into a small chat with Eugene, then make our way back to the staff room to eat dinner. There's only one piece of contraband found by the night shift teams this evening. A shiv found in one of the mainstream units, hidden inside a milk carton in the common area fridge. Without a single code for the rest of the night, we spend most of the hours just sitting and gazing vacantly at the television. It doesn't make for interesting reading for you, but for us, it's a good way to spend the shift, far better than attending a fake code for someone wanting to bail from a unit. Once the morning activity resumes at around 5:30, Rose and I check the sheet and see that our units have no one going to court, and thus go and help the admissions staff process prisoners. It makes the final couple of hours of the shift go much faster than just sitting around, and before we know it, are walking out the front gate. After giving Rose a final wave, I finally jump in my car and head home. It's a nothing shift, which I hope is repeated when I return in a few hours, although I know you don't feel the same way. Wednesday, December 5th. It's the final stretch before a couple of nights off, and I can't wait to get through the shift. Eugene greets me for the 3rd night in a row, himself on an overtime shift. Although Rose isn't working tonight, I'm pleased to see another name I recognize next to mine on the nightly roster. Jim Kruger is an officer I initially went through the induction training with, way back in the beginning of my prison career. He's one of the good guys, a hard worker, who isn't afraid to pull his weight. I know that for this shift at least, I'll have someone decent beside me. Eugene has been good enough to keep me in the same units, and I'm grateful for it. It gives me a little bit of continuity, especially when it comes to searching and stuff. I already know where to focus my searching in each, having already been there 2 nights running. I head over to the admissions book and see how many more prisoners are due to come in, and am happy to hear that there's only half a dozen more court returns, all of which should be back before 8. It's welcome news, and I'm really looking forward to a quiet night. 3rd night is always the tough one, especially when you know it's the final shift before a break. I head back to the staff room and stow my things, before heading out the door again to the undercover sitting area. It's a beautiful evening, and with the sun still out a bit, make the most of the downtime. Jim drops by a few minutes later, and after the usual meet and greet, we head back to admissions to see what the deal is. As we walk through the airlock, Control ceases movement and prepares for the final count of the day. It's all going so well until Code Alpha, Loddon South. Both Jim and I groan in unison as we do an about-face and race back out the door. With keys jangling beside me, I follow close behind Jim as we run down the corridor and through one of the gates already unlocked and held open by another officer. Moments later, we stream into the Loudon South compound, slightly behind two other officers. As we reach the already opened airlock, we hear the yelling from somewhere up on the top tier. Several prisoners are standing along the railing, all with their eyeballs firmly on something happening at the other end. Jim is ahead of me by maybe 3 or 4 meters and begins to climb the stairs 3 at a time. I manage to keep up and reach the top a little behind him. "Lockdown!" Jim yells, trying to get his voice over the shouting. When no one moves, he doubles down. "Now!" The crowd finally starts to disperse, prisoners slowly walking into their cells as we see the standoff at the other end. 2 officers are standing on either side of the corner, with a prisoner at the door of the last cell. The door to the cell is closed behind them, and the crook is shouting at the officers, telling them to fuck off. I hear more shouting from the other side of the tier, and look across to see 2 more officers starting to lock up cells on that side. As I reach for my keys to lock them up on my side, I watch as Jim heads down to back up the other officers. He's almost there when there's an almighty bang from somewhere on the lower tier, followed by a scream of pain. As I look down, I try and make sense of the scene below me, but for a few moments am confused like the rest of the eyes watching the scene play out. A strange kind of silence seemed to fall on the common area, all except the groans from inside one of the cells down there. It's much easier to explain what had happened now, hindsight a beautiful thing. But to be honest, I couldn't see what had happened, and none of what I was seeing made any sense. As the commotion played out on the second tier, a prisoner refusing to be locked down, a number of other prisoners came to their doors to watch what was happening. It was all quite innocent, people's instincts to watch altercations as natural as squinting in sunlight. As the show played out, a couple of officers, me included, began to lock down the unit, each starting at one of the ends, both upstairs and downstairs. Officer Pat Morgan began on the ground floor cells, starting with 24 and working his way backwards. But he was a fairly new officer, and the adrenaline must have really been kicking in for him, because instead of just closing the doors and locking them, he was giving them an almighty swing, and then timing his foot to meet the door on its return swing just as it hit the frame. While most of the doorways were already emptying, cell 20 wasn't, the unfortunate crook still leaning slightly outward, with his fingers curled around the doorframe's edge. He didn't have enough time to blink, let alone remove his fingers, and the steel door, probably weighing more than the crook himself, slammed home. It took the top off one finger, down to the second knuckle, crimping it like a guillotine. A shocked Pat heard the brief shout, then paused as the moaning quickly followed. As he slowly opened the door, blood spurted from the wounded man's finger and painted the front of the officer's shirt, turning him into a would-be horror movie actor. A few panicked shouts rose from some of the officers, while a couple of prisoners did what they do best, pointing and laughing, as well as calling others over to see the spectacle. The cheers rise as one of the officers calls the medical code. Behind us, the prisoner who calls the initial code is finally locked away, a wise decision considering the shitstorm that was now raining down. With 2 active codes in the same unit, nobody would be going home until the mess was cleaned up. More officers enter the unit, as well as a couple of day supervisors. Everyone is keen to know what the hell is going on, something not unusual when the prison is moments away from the final muster. One of the officers had the presence of mind to retrieve the fingertip, placing it into an empty cup. There's ice in the freezer, and I find out later that he used to be a nurse, so he was probably the best person to take care of the severed digit. He's also calming the prisoner as best he can until the nurses eventually roll into the unit. It takes maybe another 5 minutes to lock everybody else away, and once we do, Jim and I wait around for the outcome. It's our unit, so whatever happens, it's our responsibility. Although the stretcher had been wheeled to the unit by other officers, we eventually take possession of it, and once the nurses have treated the prisoner's injury as best as they can, they walk him out and he climbs aboard. We fix the harness to him and carefully head for the airlock, while everybody else disperses, save for the supervisor and Pat. For him, the night is only just beginning, as he'll need to fill out his report, plus answer any questions raised by the soup and on-duty manager. We reach the medical unit and wheel the prisoner into an observation cell. He's barely conscious and as pale as the bed sheets next to him. Our only job now is to stand watch until the ambulance arrives. It doesn't take long, and within maybe 20 minutes of us wheeling the stretcher in, 2 paramedics wheel their own stretcher in. David, the fingerless unfortunate, is transferred to the second stretcher, and Jim and I follow them out. A single escorting officer turns up a few minutes later, and focus, it's the end of the show. After dropping the stretcher back to its usual spot, Jim and I continue back to the unit and begin our nightly searching. The unit is already empty, with everyone either having completed their reports or taking their workload to another unit. For us, it makes no difference. Our night is really only just beginning, with 3 units to search, followed by a tough session of movies and trying to stay awake. Although I have plenty of snacks to see me through, I know that with the final night, my eyelids will be heavier than ever before. We finish our searching an hour and a half later and return to the staff room. With nothing found, there's not much else for us to do, other than go visiting other officers stationed within manned units, or find a quiet corner and get some secretive shut-eye. There's no other code, and I'm grateful once the morning routine begins. It's not an easy night, and at one stage, fought a severe case of head nodding. But I managed to stay awake, and by 6 the next morning, am heading back to Lawton South for our one and only court body. He's a quiet guy, maybe mid-20s, and doesn't speak a word throughout the morning routine. We escort him down to admissions, perform a strip search on him, and offer him a choice of his own clothing to wear to court. Once he's dressed again, Jim and I lock him in a cell to await his transport, then go and help with processing the rest of the prisoners heading to court. Being December, the numbers heading out to court tend to pick up the closer it gets to Christmas, although drop off dramatically in the few days immediately before. The courts try and get through as many cases as possible, something about sending those eligible home for the holidays. Either way, it makes no difference to us. We either process them out or process them in. There's a certain air of quietness this particular morning, and it's the perfect finish to a 3-shift session. As I walk out the gates an hour or so later, I look forward to having a couple of days away, although knowing there's a new round of shifts waiting for me in the not-too-distant future. Saturday, December 8th. Although initially rostered as a patrol officer, I found my shift altered by the time I reached the main airlock, with control instead sending me to Murray South. Deemed not quite as bad as Murray North, Murray South is the kind of unit that is either totally good or totally shit. As I enter the unit, the officers are preparing for lockdown muster, with a couple of prisoners still out and finalizing their runout. One is finishing mopping the common area, while the other is wiping down the bench in the kitchen. Khan greets me as I near the station, and we spend a few minutes talking crap while the other 2 officers start their count, one carrying the muster sheet. According to my friend, the day is run as smooth as can be and predicts an easy night for me. It's music to my ears, and I head off and stow my gear. Muster is phoned in, and we stand around the station while the rest of the unit grows quiet, as the prisoners absorb themselves in whatever activities they engage in. Being a management unit, the prisoners already spend 23 hours in lockdown. The shift change means nothing to them other than the unit being babysat by a single officer instead of 4. Once control call count correct, the other officers waste little time in bidding me farewell and rushing out the door. Being located so close to the front gate, they have a somewhat advantage over the rest of the prison and are normally at the forefront of the first group to be let out. For me, I immediately start my limited duties so I can relax for the rest of the night. There's not much to it. The duties simply include restocking the officer's station with items prisoners tend to ask for during the day, as well as preparing for the following morning. Cups of detergent, washing powder, sponges, plates, bowls, and cutlery. There's also a tick and flick checklist for the emergency fire plan, which needs to be updated every night. Because of the high turnover of clients, as well as constant cell shuffling, evacuation plans require 24-hour updating, and night officers generally confirm who's in which cell. All up, the duty for the night only take a little under an hour. Together with brief rounds in the morning, it leaves almost 11 hours to fill. For me, it's quite simple, because I spend most of it writing. It beats trying to find something worthwhile on television, and even when you do, it's normally limited in time, leaving a substantial gap to find something else. With writing, at least, it sometimes lasts the majority of the shift. The intercom buzzes me just as I'm about to close the final drawer after filling it with sponges. I turn to the console and hit the button. "Boss, am I on the bus tomorrow?" It's a common enough question, and one I know the answer to without checking. "Let me check," I reply, giving the voice enough hope that I will at least check for him. Do I? No. That mistake I've made before, and paid the price accordingly. You see, not everyone wants out. For some, the thought of being shipped out frightens them, especially if they already know their intended destination. They may owe money to the gangs in their new surroundings, or may already have a name that doesn't carry fondness with it. On the opposite side of the fence, what if they find out they are in fact on the bus the next day and they manage to get a message to the outside, either via a phone call or one made by another inmate? That would put the transporting crew at risk of attack, perhaps ending with an attempted breakout on some lonely back road. "No, doesn't look like it," I answer into the microphone a few minutes later. "You sure, boss?" "Yes, quite sure." It's the only answer to give, and one I no longer have an issue with it. Is it lying? Maybe. But the circumstances behind it are far more important than simply setting a prisoner's mind at ease. The ramifications are far more important than lying to an incarcerated felon. And besides, how badly is it really going to affect him if he is on the bus? Yes, it might mean visitors make the trip for nothing. But the consequences from my end compared to that? The answer I give is enough to quieten him down again, and I don't hear from him again. But not long after I shut the intercom down again, the phone rings. I answer, and as I listen to the supervisor, find my heart sinking as I hear the dreaded words. "Simon, do you have a spare obso?" Great. He wants my observation cell, and I know exactly why. Observation cells, or OBSOs, have inbuilt cameras, primarily used for monitoring prisoners housed in them. 99% of the time, we use them for those on suicide watch, or S-watch. Each S classification is based on the likelihood of a prisoner hurting themselves, the highest being S1. That means physically viewing through the trap every 15 minutes, and is not something I expected. "Can you prep it, please? I have an S1 to bring over." All the hopes I had for a relatively easy night fall to the floor with those brief words. "Anyone I know?" I ask, internally begging not to hear one name in particular. "Toby." He doesn't need to give me the surname, not even the prisoner's ID number. Both are permanently etched into my brain, like a 20-year veteran service number. If anybody in the unit was hoping for a quiet evening, their plans just got evicted. A grinning Toby Manning walked through the airlock wearing both cuffs and a grin that I instantly recognized. He was after attention, the kind of attention that would have most of the unit calling for his blood shortly after arriving. "Silly cunt swallowed a couple of batteries," one of the officers says to me as they walk him towards his cell. "They won't call me an ambulance," Toby says, the grin remaining. "You don't need an ambulance. Nurse said she's happy for you to shit them out." "But," he tries, but is pushed in through the obso cell doorway before he finishes. The soup hands me a folder as he shakes his head. He knows the drill as much as anyone and doesn't need to explain. Once the door is locked and the others start to walk out, they give me a combined look that screams two words: good luck. For the first 10 minutes or so, things are pretty quiet. I watch Toby on the monitor and he's just sitting on the edge of the bed, his head doing the usual twitch. Then I see him slide a little closer to the intercom and begin to work up his need to push the button. I know the procedure, having witnessed it dozens of times before. Toby is the kind of prisoner one needs to treat differently. He's intellectually disabled, the mind of a child inside that of a grown man, with the capability of wreaking havoc like no one else can. I personally know officers that handle this particular prisoner in one specific way, and as a result, end up with flooded cells, a prisoner covered in shit, and a night of nonstop headaches. Toby finally presses the intercom and tells me what I already know he's going to say. It's like a script, the 8-year-old child following his part of the play perfectly. "Boss, I got chest pains." I have two choices, neither of which I really wanted to follow. But this is where experience counts and takes a little bit of a leap of faith. I could either play his game or choose not to. He didn't have chest pains, and while a new officer may call the code to cover his ass, something I highly recommend, sometimes it's not how to fix the situation. "One sec, Toby." I leave the officer's station and head for his cell instead. That means any conversation I have with him isn't recorded. I can use that as a way of properly identifying the prisoner's condition. I'm not a doctor and can't make a determination on whether he really has chest pains, but given his history, it's enough to give me reason to question his statement, and speaking face-to-face with him often leads things in a different direction. I open the trap, make sure he's far enough away not to throw something at me, and peer in. "Hey, what's going on, Toby?" He grins back at me with his usual expression. "I got chest pains," he repeats. "Is this like the time the nurse explained to you the difference between anxiety and chest pain?" He pauses briefly, looks at his feet, and twitches his head a few times before looking back at me. "I don't remember." "Sure you do. Remember? I was there with you that night. The night Jai explained anxiety to you, and how sometimes being nervous can feel funny, like chest pain. Can I have a cup of coffee?" "Coffee? Maybe not coffee. It's bedtime. How about a nice cup of tea?" He begins to nod immediately, and I close the trap again. Would other officers make him a hot drink? Some, but not all. If making a cup of tea means the difference between a quiet night and one filled with a unit of angry crooks screaming for blood, I'll make the tea every time. A few minutes later, I pass through a cup of tea, which Toby gleefully takes, and just to make sure he knows what will follow, I say to him, "Let me know when you finish and I'll come for the cup." By forewarning him, he knows what's coming up, and it won't surprise him. For a prisoner renowned for throwing cups of piss through traps, there's no way I'm leaving it in there with him. The real test happens when he buzzed me 10 minutes later to tell me he's finished. I head back to the cell door, lower the trap, and take the cup he hands me. It's empty. "Thanks, Toby. Have a good sleep, okay, man?" He nods and I shut the trap again. Once back in the station, I look at the monitor and wait. He's still standing at the door, just staring at the back of it. The light is still on and will be until he asks me to switch it off. I'm hoping he does, and when I see him walk to the intercom and press the button, hold my breath. "Yes?" "Can you please switch the light off?" I reach over and snap the button. "Thank you," he finished, then sits on the bed. When I next check on him, Toby is curled up on the canvas mattress. It's quite warm and he doesn't need a blanket, which would have been canvas due to his current suicide rating. But he falls asleep anyway, leaving me the single task of checking on him 4 times an hour. I write for the duration of the night, only getting up to do my rounds when needed. Toby doesn't stir again until half an hour before the end of my shift, and I slip him another cup of tea to shut him up for the final stretch home. It's awesome. Probably one of the better nights I had to watch him. By the time I walk out, the sun is already beaming down the heat of the day. I just hope the next shift will be as good as that one. Sunday, December 9th. I'm not surprised to learn that I'm reposted into Murray South for another night. As I collect my keys, the control officer gives me a wink as he tells me the news, a wry smile forewarning me of what's to come. I don't need to ask, especially when he finishes our interaction with a very sarcastic, "Have a wonderful night." It doesn't surprise me to see the mattress from OBSO 2 leaning against the wall beside the cell door, a long tear down one side. Toby's been busy, and from the look of the soaking carpet around the door, was still going strong. "Fucking pickle," Jimmy said as I enter the station, shaking his head in disgust. "Oh," I reply, "like that." Cunt threw piss on Jonesy, then spat at me and Donna. "I see he's tried to wash the floors for you as well." Soup shut the water off. He's still got a couple of cups of piss in there. "S rating?" I ask. "Still S1. Fuck," I mutter under my breath. "And he was so good last night." "Yeah, that didn't last long. See what he did to the bed?" Being a canvas mattress meant it should have been tamper-proof, but I know that around some of these prisoners, nothing was tamper-proof. As crazy as it sounds, some prisoners could eat through steel with their teeth. Toby begins to kick the door of his cell, and several other prisoners yell for him to stop. He pauses briefly, as if to listen, then resumes without acknowledging them. Jimmy shakes his head, then continues on with his final duties. For them, the nightmare will shortly end for another shift. The kicking continues as the muster is conducted, the officers bypassing Toby's cell on their way around the unit. They lift each cell's window flap, peer inside, then continue on to the next. 10 minutes later, Control calls the muster correct, and it's barely seconds before everyone has left me alone in a unit filled with crazy people. Toby continues his banging, and a couple of the other crooks call for me to shut him up. Their frustrations will soon turn on me if I don't at least try and do something. I check the monitor and see that Toby has covered the camera with something. I have no doubt that it's moistened toilet paper, the only thing he'd have access to. I click the intercom and hope to at least engage him on some level. "Yo, Toby." The kicking pauses and I repeat myself. Chances are he didn't hear my words the first time due to the noise. "I want my fucking light off," he yells. Is that what all this is about? Again, he pauses, maybe trying to rethink his tactic. "You were so good last night. What happened?" I ask, trying to keep him engaged. Around the unit, the rest of the voices have dropped, and I know that they're trying their hardest to try and listen in. "Cunts won't turn my lights off." "Give me a minute, all right? I'll see what I can do." Coming into the unit fresh gives me a bit of an edge as I can separate myself from the previous crew. But to make sure I don't step on any toes, I give the supervisor a call, just to touch base. "Hey, Dutch," I say as Norm Holland answers the phone. "Simon, you got updates on Manning?" "Yeah. You been up here yet?" I ask. Like me, Dutch is the incoming supervisor, and what happens from here on in is our call. I know Dutch, and as far as he has ever been concerned, the shift is ours to do with as we please. If I want to continue to piss Manning off, he will back me 100%. But he also knows that I don't operate like that. If I can de-escalate a situation by giving a little, then so be it. Better to give the prick something small and bring peace back to the unit than be a dick and keep everyone wound up for most of the night. "Nah, not yet. I hear the water is switched off. How is he?" "I think I can calm him. Leave it with me." "All right. I'll put the water back on during my rounds, but only if he behaves." "Thanks, Dutch." I hang up and return to the monitor. Still nothing but darkness, and I flick the intercom on. "Hey, Toby," I call. "Yeah?" "Still want your light out?" "Yes, please," Toby calls back. "All right, I'll come and flick them off for you, okay?" "Thank you," Toby calls back. "But I'm going to need you to remove whatever you got on the camera. Otherwise, Control will get pissed with me. Is that cool?" Another brief pause as he considers. Then, just as I think he's going to refuse, he says, "Sure." I cancel the call, then see the camera refocus on his face as he removes the toilet paper, dropping the sheet of paper into the toilet bowl. Keeping my end of the bargain, I make my way to his cell door. There are two ways to turn the OPSO cell lights off. The first is via the switch in the officer's station. The second is the switch next to the cell door. What I want is to get closer to Toby so he recognizes me from the night before. It may help later that night, particularly when trying to get him to sleep. I lift the window flap and peer in, give him a wave and say, "Just switching it off. You all good?" Toby nods and walks a little closer to the door. "Can I have a cup of tea?" I nod, but don't give in immediately. "Give me an hour, okay? I just got some shit to do, then I'll grab you a cuppa. You still got cups in there?" He nods almost frantically, bends down and picks up the 2 cups sitting beside his bunk. "I'll grab them later as well." I shoot him a thumbs up and he tries to repeat the gesture. Once I flick the lights off, I make my way back to the station, grab the evacuation plan and start my duties. To tell you the truth, I'm a little surprised at how easily Toby came around. On a bad day, he wouldn't even acknowledge your words. It's almost 2 hours later when Dutch finally drops in on his rounds. His own duties bring him to my unit twice during the shift, unless a code is called. I'm already sitting in the station working on the computer when he walks in, and once he's finished his checks, comes to where I'm sitting. "How is he?" I nod. "He's been quiet. Think he's asleep," I said, pointing at the monitor. Despite the lights being off, the monitor has night mode, and we see Toby lying on his bed as if in broad daylight. "Okay, I'll switch the water back on now. If he starts anything, call me. I'll come straight back and switch it off again." "All good, thanks," I said. A few minutes later, Dutch exits the unit and I'm left alone again. Still 8 hours of unplanned shift to get through. If you have read the Prison Days Inmates Book 1, then you know what Toby Manning is capable of. He's a matchstick, living in a tinderbox of dynamite and petroleum. All it takes is a spark for things to kick off, and I've seen it plenty of times. The good thing was, he never asked for that cup of tea, because Toby Manning fell asleep. He didn't wake again until around 5 the next morning, and when he did, I gave him the cup of tea before he had a chance to repeat his request. That was enough of a gesture to keep him quiet for the rest of the morning, and when Jimmy walked back into the unit a little before 7, had the unit perfectly quiet, just the way you want a unit to be when starting a shift. Wednesday, December 12th. I came into work after a couple of nights off and found myself allocated as a spare officer. That meant all of the possible positions had already been allocated to other officers. Control asked me to go and see the duty supervisor for instructions, but when I attended her office, found another 3 officers also on standby. "2 of you are free to take annual leave if you have it," Sophie said, and before I had a chance to consider the alternative, flung my hand in the air. "Done," she said. And that was how I managed to get myself an extra night off, all for simply having fast reflexes and enough hours in my annual leave pool. It didn't take me long to return to the front of the prison, hand back my radio and keys, and exit before the day shift crew could. Now that's the kind of workday I can live with. Thursday, December 13th. Returned for the first of 2, and when I fronted Control's window, was advised that I was rostered in Yara South to watch a prisoner with an S classification. I grabbed my keys and radio and headed for the unit. This was another one of those shifts that can either go really well or really pear-shaped. It usually depended on the prisoner. As I headed for the unit, there was but a single prayer running through my mind, a prayer I hoped would be one of the few to be answered. I hoped that my S-Watch wasn't Toby Manning. It turned out that it wasn't Toby, but another prisoner by the name of Sam Tucker. He was intellectually disabled and had a taste for underage girls. A convicted sex predator, he has spent a considerable amount of time in prison. Aged in his 30s, he was the type of person that tried his hardest to get the attention that Toby seemed, but never managed to reach the same level. He just pissed a lot of people off. Entering the unit, a few prisoners are still out and running around before lockdown, getting their hot waters, toilet paper, and other stuff. The staff were prepping for the final muster, and after I stowed my gear, returned to the officer station for Tucker's paperwork. I stood back as I read it, trying to remain out of the way of the officers. Tucker sat in a cell near the station, the monitor on and showing him lying on the bed. But unlike other observation cells, Yara South had the type that had 2 doors, one inner door and one outer door. The inner door is made up of steel bars, all covered in thick, clear perspex. The outer door is made from thin metal and is called the outer skin. If a prisoner was classified S1, the outer door was generally kept open to allow the officers easy visibility. But with my prayers answered about Toby, they weren't about the crook's classification. He was an S1 and needed 15-minute checks throughout the night. Because Yara South isn't a regularly manned unit at night, I was given the task of watching a single prisoner for the 12 hours. A single prisoner taking up the resources of an officer for an entire shift. And why was he an S1? Because he wanted to make a phone call whilst being locked down, then sliced his leg open deep enough to warrant 22 stitches. The psych nurse placed Tucker on S1 after he repeatedly threatened to kill himself, and there I was, given the honor of watching him for the night. To them, it was a game, nothing more. They had no outside life, and this was their home. Once the unit was completely locked down, the staff conducted their muster while I was chatting to Eugene, the day soup for the unit. He'd been called in for overtime, and it was good catching up with him. Working nights meant missing out on a lot of social time with friends, so any catch-ups were good. It didn't take Control long to call count correct, and the officers even less to vacate the unit. Before long, the familiar silence filled the unit. The usual murmur of music from that cell, the faint sounds of a sitcom from another. I checked the monitor and saw Tucker sitting on the edge of his bed, just staring into space. He wasn't too bad once the unit was quiet, and I knew that as long as I didn't give in to his games, it wouldn't be long before he laid down and slept the night away. As I sat down to check my emails, the radio crackled as Murray South called the code Mike. I didn't recognize the voice, but thought it sounded new. I grinned, wondering if a newbie had been dropped into the unit. I could only imagine what Toby Manning would be doing, especially knowing a fresh officer was watching him for the night. It would be an impossible task. Some minor radio chatter followed, but being in my own unit was unable to assist. It sounded as if Toby was making a rightful ass out of himself, and I was thankful at being on the opposite side of the prison. "Could I have a tea, please?" suddenly drifted out to me, and I looked up to see Tucker standing in the doorway of his cell. The clear perspex didn't do much to hide him. "Need something warm inside to sleep?" I asked. "Yes." He's one of those people that speaks in a matter-of-factly tone. Too shy to hold an adult conversation, he simply speaks in questions and answers. "One sec," I replied, and finished checking the last few emails. Once finished, I headed for the kitchen and made the hot drink. "Just the one for tonight. I'll come bring you one in the morning." He nods as I hand the drink through the trap. "Thanks," he said, before turning back to his bed. I closed the outer skin door, just swinging it closed enough for the lock to lean against the inner door. It's enough to stop him staring out at me, but means I don't need to unlock the skin door every time I need to open it. I return to the computer and check a few more reports, then shut it down and open up a new page, ready to unleash my inner author. The unit begins to dim as the outside sun finally disappears over the horizon. The intercom buzzes a few minutes later, and Tucker asks the question I was hoping to hear. "Boss, can you please turn my light off?" I oblige immediately, then watch as the monitor briefly flickers, the screen switching to night mode. I watch as Tucker climbs into his bed, pulls the covers over himself, and stops moving. With luck, it would be the last I'll see of him for the shift. I turn the volume on my radio down and sit it on the desk beside me, before returning to work page. As I begin tapping away on the keys, the unit's usual noises consume my thoughts as I continue writing a novel about serial killers. It's the story of a young girl who harbors the brutal essence of a serial killer relative, one who featured in a previous book of mine. The story is still coming together for me, and I'm completely absorbed for almost an hour and a half. That's when the officers responsible for the unit come through the airlock, ready to do their nightly search. I greet each, then don a pair of gloves and help out. It's rare to find anything in this unit, but with the possibility always there, we conduct an appropriate search. The two officers search the common area, while I head into the kitchen. There's always plenty of hiding spots to check, and it takes almost 20 minutes to finish. Once back out in the unit, the other two bid me farewell just as the radio crackles to life. "Code Mike, Murray South." The groan from the other two is in unison, sounding like a choir. Shaking their heads, they slowly head out through the airlock, neither in a hurry to reach their destination. When Manning gets on a roll, he really gets on a roll. I return to my desk and check the monitor for Tucker, then fill out his paperwork for what would be repeated 4 dozen times this shift. With him sleeping for the majority of the night, it will hopefully give me plenty of time to continue writing. The hours pass slowly, and I hear 2 more codes called throughout the night. One is for Murray South again, although a phone call from the soup later on reveals it wasn't for Toby. The other was for Murray North, someone needing medical attention. The morning can't come fast enough, with my eyes virtually hanging from their sockets for the final few hours. With the shift ending in relative harmony for me, I begin to wonder whether December is one of the few months where things may be a little easier for us. Perhaps the festive season is spreading its cheer and goodwill, filling everyone with the joy regardless of where they are. Or perhaps it's the quiet before the storm, and shit is about to hit the fan big time. I know how quickly things can change in this place. The unpredictability, something never far from anyone's mind. Friday, December 14th. Almost halfway through the month, I think to myself as I walk back into the jail. I head to the control window and wait patiently as the officer chats on the phone to someone. Around me, other people are returning their keys and radio, thankful to be ending another shift. I see a few people I know, say hi and talk shit while continuing to wait. Finally, the call ends and the officer comes to the window. "Soup has got you back in Yarra South," he said with a grin on his face. "Good old Tucker is waiting for you to babysit him." I simply flip him the bird, grab my keys and radio, and head out the door. Could he simply go to sleep for a second night? The unit staff look a little flustered as I walk through the airlock a few minutes later. The four of them are scurrying around like angry ants, running this way and that as they appear to be trying to calm an argument between two crooks. Both are intellectually disabled, with one also suffering cerebral palsy. He moves with a couple of crutches, and I watch as he slowly hobbles after the other prisoner, trying to scream at him. I drop my stuff in the station and go and stand next to one of the officers, a lady named Ricky. I haven't seen her in quite some time, and she gives me a very brief one-armed hug. "Looks serious," I mock. "It is. Andrew lost his Spider-Man teddy, and he thinks Owen stole it." "Spider-Man teddy?" I ask, raising an eyebrow. "Oh yeah. Don't you know we only roll with the cool guys here?" Andrew Taylor is a regular in the unit, in and out of prison his whole life. He's angry about his disease and often blames the world for it. One of the other officers in the unit, a man named Eric Nobles, is a genuine shit-stirrer and doesn't shy away from sending insults wherever he happens to be. "All right, Andrew, quit trying to squish spiders and get back to your cell." There's a roar of laughter from the crooks lined up on the second tier. Watching Andrew try and walk is like watching someone trying to step on a scurrying insect, and the joke is caught immediately by the greedy onlookers. I do my best to try and hide the smile threatening to break. The insult is one of those that isn't funny at all, but because it crosses the line so obnoxiously, that's what makes people smile. Fuck you," Andrew stutters, raising a crutch as if to swing it. Eric fails to see the threat, ignoring the raised crutch and continuing to herd the prisoner back in the direction of his cell. Andrew doesn't resist, turning and slowly making his way towards his open cell door. Once locked in, the rest of the crowd begin to disperse, each standing in or by their open door, waiting for their good-night lockdown. The officers waste little time in shutting the unit down, and before I finish putting my food in the fridge, the silence is already descending on the place. "Tucker's been all right today. Shouldn't give you much bother," Ricky says as I return to the station. The others are still adding the numbers, until Eric phones it in. "Good," I reply. "He slept like a baby last night. Let's hope he repeats that again." It's not long before control calls count correct, and within a few seconds of the call, find myself waving goodnight to the exiting officers. I check the monitor again and see Tucker sitting on the edge of his bed, not really doing anything. He has the option of watching television, with one housed inside a tamper-proof box hanging from one wall. But I've never known him to ask for it. Instead, happy to just entertain himself with the voices inside his own head. I check my emails, and as I'm flicking through, hear a low moan coming from one of the cells in the far corner. I look up, turn one ear towards the sound, and try and listen. In all honesty, it sounded like someone wanking, but there was something more to it. I slowly walked out of the station and tried to stealth my way towards the sound. Normally, someone would be watching and have a stupid comment, but tonight, only the sound broke the silence. Once I was close enough, I realized that the sound, whatever it was coming from Andrew's cell. Without pausing, I dropped the trap and peered inside, unsure of what to expect. What I found was Andrew sitting on his bed, blood pouring from one wrist. He'd sliced himself with a plastic plate that he'd torn up, and the blood was visibly seeping from the wound and pooling on the floor beneath him. He just sat and grinned at me, with a weird expression I hadn't seen before. I grabbed my radio, hit the duress button, then called the code mic. Control answered immediately and repeated the call to the rest of the stations. Leaving the trap down, I returned to the station and answered the phone, which I knew would be the Soup. A lot of time, these codes were just crooks playing, and Soups would phone to ask what was happening. "Andrew Taylor has sliced his wrist. It's bleeding a lot," I tell the voice on the other end, and he doesn't need convincing of the urgency. As I hang up the phone, the first couple of officers enter the unit, and I throw them some gloves, then put on a pair myself. We head to the door, and I call the supervisor on the radio for permission to crack the cell. Without a Soup present, permission needs to be obtained, as well as 3 officers being present. He gives it a second later, and one of the other guys unlocks the cell. He leads the way inside, grabs Andrew's wrist, and puts pressure on the wound. I grab a towel and hand it to him to help stem the flow. Thankfully, the nurses arrive only a minute or so later, relieving us from the prisoner and taking over. They spend a few minutes later working on his wrist, while Andrew simply lays back with that same grin on his face. It doesn't take long for Andrew to be wheeled out on the trolley. It's so common for crooks to cut themselves and get wheeled out that many officers are simply immune to the shock of the amount of blood that is sometimes seen. It's a lot. While nothing can prepare you for the first time you see it, it's enough to numb you for the next time, and the time after that, and so on. As 2 officers wheel the trolley out and the nurses follow close behind, I nod to the Soup, which he returns. It's a wordless gesture to indicate that I'll send my report through shortly. I made the call, I do the paperwork. It's a pretty simple rule, and once the unit is mine again, I check the monitor to see what Tucker's up to, then set about to type my only report for the night. It's another simple night, with Tucker sleeping for the majority of it. Even when he is awake, he leaves me alone to my own devices and either stares out the window or watches the paint fade on the wall. It's a tedious existence for many of these guys, and you sometimes ask yourself why. They don't seem to have a purpose in life, other than to create as much misery on everyone else as possible. Maybe that is their purpose. The hours pass by, and eventually I'm relieved from my post by a fresh crew. I brief them on the only eviction of the night and happily sign off for what would be the final shift of the week. As I walk out through the gates, I start to whistle, thankful to be back out in the real world, a world that, for the most part, is one I understand. Monday, December 17th. Despite being rostered on in Murray North, I call in sick and utilize a day off. I head to the doctor's for a certificate to make sure I'm not questioned. Unfortunately, this time of year leaves a lot of people on edge, especially when half their work crew decides to fall sick at the same time. The certificate is a way for me to cover my own ass, and I email it through the first opportunity I get. Tuesday, December 18th. Returning to the prison, I grab my radio and keys and make my way towards Murray North, the saddest unit in the prison by far. When I say sad, I don't mean that it's a place where a lot of crying gets done. It's sad for a lot of other reasons. The prisoners in that unit are an entirely different bunch to normal. It's considered the harshest punishment for a prisoner who breaks the rules and used to be the unit most feared. But times change, and with it, the tolerance and acceptance of certain things. These days, Murray North is a holiday camp, the perfect place for prisoners to come and unwind. Once in their single cell, they have everything brought to them, done for them, and handed to them. Think prison is punishment? Think prison is a place to get reformed? What's that word a lot of bureaucrats like to use? Rehabilitation? Spend a single night in the officer's station of Murray North and tell me about rehabilitation. I try and keep my own opinion out of these books as much as possible because I really want you, the reader, to form your own opinion. I've received 1-star reviews for not addressing my personal feelings during my writing, and I think those readers have missed the point. But when it comes to Murray North, let it be known that I think it's disgraceful with the way things are run in that place. Unfortunately, no matter my own opinion, things will never change. The prisoners in the unit are made up of both protection and mainstream, making the unit a toxic zone from the moment you step inside. They burn each other relentlessly. The protection prisoners, or boners, dishing it out just as much as they comp from the others. It's an endless screaming match, with insults flying in all directions. I can hear the prisoners long before I walk through the airlock. As I step inside, I see one officer over by the washing machines, busy loading up prisoners' dirty laundry. Another one is in the kitchen, wiping up the remains from dinner that would have served an hour before. Another would have delivered each meal to the individual cells, kind of like Uber Eats, all while the crooks are lying back on their beds and enjoying the movie channel. Pete waves at me from the console, then continues chatting to whomever was venting their issues through the intercom. I drop my gear in the small officer's room, dump my food in the fridge, and head back out, the shouting already hurting my brain. Pete continues listening to the voice, shaking his head in a whatever gesture, and rolls his eyes at me. I check the muster sheet and read the list of names. I know Manning is next door, but still make sure that he's not in the unit. If he was here, I think my head would definitely explode. As I grab a seat in the station, a couple of officers grab the muster, shoot me a wave, and continue on. Given the amount of work needed in this unit, I sense their exhaustion, as well as their appreciation for the end of the shift. "You've got one obso free, the rest are full," a voice says from behind me, and I turn to see Claire. "Hey," I reply, "how are you?" "Not bad, just a long day. I just spoke with Hanson, and he said to keep that obso ready. Said he might have someone to go into it." She shakes her head and leans over to sign the log sitting before Pete as he continues his conversation. Pete returns her shaking head with a finger, then shuts the intercom down. "Any idea who?" I ask. "No, but someone said it could be a transfer from the city." I nod and turn to see the officers climb the stairs to continue their muster. Voices are still shouting at each other from both the top and bottom tiers. Rob, one of the regulars in here, enters the station, throws me a wave, then gestures towards the row of washing machines. "Just a couple more loads of drying for you to do. Didn't get a chance to finish it all." I throw him a nod. Although unimpressed by the notion of doing these prisoners' laundry, I know it's non-negotiable, nor is it their fault. They have enough on their plate during the day already, without adding dirty jocks and socks to the list. The officers conducting the muster return to the station and finish adding up their numbers. The rest of the crew drop into chairs around me and patiently wait for the signal to go, with the end of the day now insatiably close. Once the numbers are added up and the phone call to control made, the rest of the crew patiently wait as the unit continues their boisterous conversations. I sit amongst the officers, listening to their excitement at the prospect of going home. It takes barely 10 seconds for the unit to clear of officers once control calls count correct, and I'm left alone to monitor a unit of the worst crooks in the prison. I can feel their eyes on me from beneath their doors as I prep the computer to check my emails and stuff. Unlike the prisons you see on television, here we don't get to leave the common area and hide in a cubicle behind thick tinted glass watching the unit instead on a bunch of monitors. In this prison, the officer stations are situated almost smack bang in the middle of the floor, accessible through a gap in the bench. This means that if they ever get bored, the crooks have the perfect vantage point from where to toy with their only source of outside entertainment, me. I've heard of prisoners spending countless hours burning officers who sit in the very spot I'm now located in. Some have even quit their jobs entirely because of it. Luckily for me, they're much too focused on each other tonight, and that leaves me to go about my own schedule without interference. I go through the small amount of emails, delete those I don't need, then shut the program, instead turning my attention to the washing. I want to finish it as quickly as possible so I can return to my writing. 2 of the 4 dryers continue to heat the clothes, while the other 2 sit quietly. I pop the doors, reach in and grab the laundry bag that's always included with each load. The bags that have the cell numbers written on them, each cell allocated 1 bag. After bagging the clothes up, I refill each dryer with another load, then head to the cells, bags slung over my shoulder like a laundry Santa. I open each trap and immediately push the bags through until I feel the prisoner pull it the rest of the way. "Thanks, boss," each of them says, and I close the traps before returning to the station. Just as I grab a seat, the phone rings and instantly I recall what Claire had told me earlier in the evening. "Murray North," I say, answering the call. "Simon, it's Hanson. Can you prep cell 4? S1 coming in." Inside, I groan. "Sure thing." The message is short and snappy, and I head to the cell, make sure it's devoid of anything that shouldn't be in there. For an S1, there can be nothing except the canvas mattress. The cell is already empty, and I drop the mattress down, take a final check, then head back to the station, leaving the door open as I exit. The rest of the unit seems to quieten a little, and as if to acknowledge their ever-watchful eye, one of the crooks yells, "Hey boss, someone coming in?" "Maybe," I shout back, but mostly ignore it. "Better not be Manning," someone else yells. "Nah, not Manning. He's still next door. Sheepy just said so." The soup enters the unit a few moments later, followed by a couple of tactical officers. Then come 2 more, dragging a prisoner backwards between them. To complete the parade, a snarling German shepherd brings up the rear, the handler struggling to keep the dog under control. Its teeth continue snapping at the crook barely a foot from his face, drool falling as it walks. The barking immediately eclipses all the other voices, and for a moment, the dog is the only sound in the unit. Then the dragged prisoner tried to pull free, wrenching his shoulders this way and that, but the officers hold tight and make their way into the open cell door. "This one should make your night," the soup says before handing me a stack of folders. "Make sure you keep an eye on him and call me if you need anything." After switching on the monitor, I see the officers line up behind the prisoner who's held kneeling against the far wall. Each slowly starts to exit until there's just 2 left, 1 on each arm. Without hesitation, they let go and immediately rush out before the crook has a chance to get back to his feet. Just as he does, the door slams home and he's sealed in. The screaming starts immediately, but the language he's speaking is foreign to me. He charges at the door and doesn't slow when he hits it, the sound almost deafening around the unit. "That pickle was transferred here today from the other side. He's a top-line psych, so wouldn't be dropping the trap." A top-line psych means he has a rating of maximum in the psych department, one of the true psychos out there. And in the next couple of hours that followed, he was about to show me just how psycho he could be. First, he started by kicking the door repeatedly, then added punching to his repertoire. I can only try and describe the sound, because it wasn't something to enjoy. Imagine being stuck in an empty hallway, with every sound amplified through echoes. Now imagine someone standing right next to you, grab a metal lid from a garbage can, and start hitting it with a hammer repeatedly. That gives you a vague idea. Some of the other prisoners began shouting abuse at the new arrival, but rather than slow him, it seemed to spur him on. I continued watching him on the monitor, frantically pacing back and forth in his tiny cell, kicking the door with each pass. After around 10 minutes of this happening, he began to headbutt the door. Hard. He'd swing his head with enough force to impact the door almost as hard as his foot. Before long, I could see blood where his head hit. I called the soup on the radio and waited for him to phone. Once he did, I passed on the information. Cunt should never have been transferred to us. Fucking idiots. Hopefully he'll get picked up soon. But in the meantime, you're stuck with him. Just keep me posted. He didn't wait for a response. I continued watching him, the man appearing to be completely off his nut. He would scream abuse in some foreign tongue, then rage on the door with feet and head. He tried his hands, but being cuffed behind his back made it impossible. Finally, I watched him sit on the edge of the bed and pause. But what I believed to be the start of him quieting down was him simply working up the courage for his next showpiece. He suddenly launched himself onto his feet and charged the opposite wall, taking a running jump at it before headbutting the concrete as hard as he could. He briefly paused, turned, and repeated the process on the opposite wall. Before long, more blood splatters appeared. I couldn't watch. I called the soup a second time, and when he rang, relayed the information. "This dude will be dead within an hour if this keeps up," I said. "All right, leave it with me. I'll try and get the psych nurse up to you." He hung up again, and all I could do was sit and watch as the guy continued to bash his own brain in. The airlock door opened almost 10 minutes later, and in walked the psych nurse, accompanied by 4 tactical officers. The nurse spent almost 20 minutes trying to get the prisoner to talk, but to no avail. He would scream something, then resume pacing, at one point charging at the trap before one of the officers slammed it shut. "I'm trying to have him moved," the nurse told me, once he knew there was nothing else he could do. "Hopefully, they won't take too long to arrive." They were the Inter-Prison Transport Unit, a highly trained group of officers that were used for high-risk prisoner transportations, as well as, you guessed it, psych transfers. But it did take quite some time for them to arrive. 3 hours, in fact. For those 3 hours, I watched this guy hammer himself into the walls of his cell until they looked as if he'd try to repaint them a shade of red. The blood looked as if it was everywhere, and still he continued to charge at them. I wondered what sort of drugs he was on, because to me, there was little chance anybody could do that without something in their system. Once the transport arrived, all 6 of them, including their own dog, I watched a new level of craziness. The lead officer opened the trap and called for the prisoner to drop to his knees. He either ignored the calls or just didn't hear them. The officer tried repeatedly, but after several minutes of being ignored, he simply stood back and gestured to one of his other officers. That one stood forward, pulled a can of pepper spray from his pocket, and began giving it a quick shake. He then dropped the trap, took aim, and sprayed directly into the face of the crook. He barely flinched, nor did he slow down. Let me tell you, I've had pepper spray shot into my face. I know the feeling, and it is not something anybody could ignore. It's like getting slammed in the balls by a baseball bat in full swing. And that guy never even flinched. They watched him through the viewing window, while I continued watching on the monitor. Once they realized it didn't have any effect, the officer dropped the trap for a second time and emptied the spray can into the cell. While the cloud of gas now surrounded the pacing prisoner, he still wasn't showing any signs of effect, simply continuing his ranting. A minute later, a second officer stepped forward and emptied a second can of pepper spray, the entire contents deployed in one go. When the prisoner still continued to pace, the leading officer motioned for the dog and prepared his troops, each donning a gas mask. What they were going to do was charge the cell and take the crook down. It is still one of the most dangerous things to do because of limited space and a highly volatile prisoner ready to kill. The first stood back a little to try and give the pepper spray as much time as possible to dissipate. They weren't too fussed about the crook charging the walls, hoping for him to knock himself out. But that was something that wasn't about to happen. They counted themselves down as a silence descended over the unit. Someone finally cracked the door, and I watched as 5 officers charged through into the cell, launching themselves onto the crook. Although he tried to resist, he had little chance with his hands already cuffed. The dog began snapping a few inches from his face, and that seemed to freeze him. To say I was happy to see that crazy psycho dragged from the building is an understatement. Even some of the other prisoners cheered as he left. That prisoner was probably one of the craziest I'd ever seen, still haunting me to this day. If he hadn't been taken out when he was, I only wonder how much damage he would have done to himself by morning. Thankfully, the rest of the night went quickly, and after the early excitement, the rest of the unit quietened as well. I did what I needed to do with little interruption, and honestly, walking out the next morning felt better than it had in a long time. I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. I was thankful that I had a few days off. Saturday, December 22nd. After the crazy events from my last shift, I was looking forward to a nice, quiet night, and thankfully, someone was listening. I was rostered in Goulburn West, considered one of the quietest units in the prison. It held mostly long-term prisoners, and many of them were there simply to pass time, do what they owed, and move on. The officers who worked there were also mostly long-termers. I doubt any of them had less than 5 years' experience, with most over 10. That meant they had the unit working the way they wanted, with little interruption to their normal routine. After initial handshakes and usual greetings out of the way, Graham took me through the muster, as well as things that needed doing throughout the night. It wasn't much of a list, mostly restocking the cupboards and updating the evacuation plan. They knew I was more than capable and thus kept the instructions to a minimum. They ran the unit like clockwork, and once the final muster had been called in, simply stood around waiting for the call to be let out. It came fairly quickly, and before I knew it, the unit was mine, alone once more to do as I pleased. The prisoners sounded quiet, with just a murmur of a television here and a radio there. Every now and then a toilet would flush somewhere, the swoosh of water breaking the silence. It was without a doubt a far cry from my previous shift, and I savored every moment. My walk seemed to have an extra spring in each step. The unit even had a small Christmas tree sitting on the bench of the officer's station. It only stood about 1.5 feet tall, with maybe half a dozen baubles, but it did what it needed to, reminding those who noticed of the season. With Goulburn West delivering the kind of shift I needed, there's very little to tell. I know you were hoping for some extra excitement, but other than one prisoner buzzing me at 2 a.m. with a bad case of diarrhea, there's nothing else to share. I simply phoned the nurse, who brought the prisoner something to take, and that was it. The shift ended before I knew it, and I managed to get in a couple of seasonal greetings on the way out from those who I would probably not see before Christmas came. All up, it was the kind of shift I loved. Sunday, December 23rd. As if gifting me a rostering gift for Christmas, the owners that be were kind enough to return me to Goulburn West for a second night. It was perfect. The crew from the previous day were all there, and this time we talked about their Christmas plans before Control called count correct. Graham was planning to take his family to Hawaii for a week, while Tara was off to get married. I think it was her 4th marriage. Glenn was the only one to stay, scoring an overtime shift on both Christmas Day and New Year's Eve. He was unmarried, had no children, and didn't celebrate the season at all. He was just one of those guys who lived for his job. Once count was called correct and the unit was handed to me for a second time, I relaxed for the first part and watched Home Alone on the television. It's still one of my favorite holiday movies, besides Die Hard. Yes, Die Hard is a Christmas movie. The night went even better than the previous night, with no 2 a.m. calls for help with toiletry issues. It was one of the quietest nights I've ever experienced. Just before midnight, I heard someone playing Christmas music in their cell. Several songs rang out, drifting around the unit. It felt strange hearing those melodies play out in this place. Together with the tree sitting before me, it felt a bit like a Tim Burton movie, the setting just not right for the sound reel. Morning couldn't come soon enough, and as the sunlight began to stream through the early hours, I realized that what lay ahead of me was Christmas, with 2 whole days to spend with my family. Wednesday, December 26th. The time away was magnificent, but I'm not sure whether this will come across the right way. As I walked back into the prison and made my way through control, I wondered whether I ever actually left at all. I caught my own reflection, saw myself standing in the window, and just felt like this place had some sort of hold over me. I was rostered on patrol, and once inside, headed to the supervisor's office to see the details of my shift. There were already a few people heading towards the front door, and I greeted several, wishing a few a Merry Christmas. The soup's office was locked and the area deserted, not unusual considering the time of year. Instead, I went and said hello to Charles, who was manning the book. Despite admissions being locked up, certain staff still had specific duties to perform, regardless of the day. "Were you here Christmas Day?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, why? Any excitement?" He looked at the floor. His face instantly turned serious. "You missed the fight." "What fight?" I asked, completely oblivious. Crook and Yarn North went nuts. They say Tony Malone refused to hand him a spare plate, and the crook threw a bin into the station, and when a couple of the other officers interjected, he turned on them. Big Maori dude. "Seriously? How are they?" I asked, understanding his frankness. "Pete Stewart was knocked unconscious. Alan Bates lost a couple of teeth. And Tony?" "The crook chased him for a bit, but Tony managed to outrun him until backup arrived." I've known Pete Stewart for a long time and can say he's one of the most kind-hearted people I know. Hearing of his assault truly saddened me. And through the beauty of time, I can now tell you that as much as I want to tell you Pete recovered and went back to work, I can't. Pete never returned to work. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital and eventually returned home to his wife, also an officer. I found out from her a few weeks later that Pete suffered a brain injury that would never heal. It's a brain injury that affects every aspect of his life in a way that has cost him a lot more than anybody would be willing to sacrifice for a job. For the sake of protecting his identity, I won't share the specific injury Pete sustained, but I will say that not only did it cost him the chance of returning to prison, but he also lost the ability to work anywhere else. I returned to the soup's office after dropping my things into the staff room, and this time found the door open. Eugene was sitting inside, with Claire beside him. They were looking over something, and so I let them be, instead checking the shift sheet pinned to the notice board. I was a spare, with no allocation. December was getting better for me, and after greeting the supervisors, headed back to the staff room. As I opened the door to head inside, the radio comes alive, with someone calling a code. "Code Alpha, Tambo East." Control repeats the call to all stations as I turn and run towards the gate. By the time I reach the end of the corridor, I hear a second code. Code Alpha, Tambo East, urgent. I hear footsteps behind me as I add a sprint into my step. The urgency in the voice of the second code sends a chill through me, and I try to close the distance a bit quicker. Ahead of me, the corridor gates are already opened, allowing for a clear run to the unit. As I run into the yard, I can already hear the shouting from inside the unit. It sounds like a lot, and I wonder whether the stress of the season is finally broken. There's officers in front and behind me as we burst through the airlock. I hear the commotion of a lot of yelling and wonder just how bad it's going to be. There's crooks lined up along the top-tier rail, looking down at the common area, where it appears several crooks have gone toe-to-toe with officers. "Move, move, move!" is suddenly shouted beside me, and I step sideways as a tactical officer pushes through, his baton already out and raised. The best thing for ordinary officers to do is to either dive in or step aside. Standing around stunned isn't going to help anyone. From what I could see, the situation was getting worse, with almost a dozen scuffles continuing to evolve. The radio roared to life, amplified by the sheer numbers now inside the unit. "All available staff to Tambo East," came through loud and clear as I ducked beneath a swinging arm that came flying in my direction. I threw my own punch without thinking, more of a reflex action. It hit the crook in the middle, and he stumbled back as one of the other tactical boys tackled him and brought him down. I jumped in and grabbed one arm, while one of the other officers grabbed his other arm. That was when I heard the call that would decide the battle, a battle I still had no idea what it was over. "Deploy spray," was called by someone behind me, and that's when I knew shit was about to hit the fan. I pressed my face down as far as I could, turning away from the prisoner as much as possible. The sound of the pepper spray was enough to convince most that the fight was over, but somehow a few continued on. The screams of agony were numerous as the gas rapidly spread above the crowd. That was when I made the mistake of looking across to where another crook was still trying to throw punches. One of the tactical officers deployed their pepper spray, and as they finished, dropped their arm. The spray hadn't quite finished, and the final few spurts hit me directly in the face. The pain was instant, like needles stabbed into my eyeballs. I did my best to hold the struggling arm as taut as possible, the prisoner desperately trying to break free. Only when someone tapped my shoulder and told me to exit did I finally let go. I heard the handcuff slam home around his wrist, then his squeals as his wrist was pulled towards his other. Once outside, I was glad to have someone guide me to a water bucket, where I did my best to try and wash my eyes out. It's not as easy as it sounds, and the burning continues well after I dunk my head completely underwater. It's almost as if the spray is coated to my eyeball, refusing to wash off, made up of glass particles that stab your eyeballs. 4 officers are eventually taken to hospital, the worst with a broken jaw. Almost a dozen are treated for exposure to pepper spray, with many more prisoners adding to that number. And while it may sound like a battle over something serious, we find out later that the entire incident happened because one of the prisoners was being moved into another unit due to overcrowding. A cell had become available in Tambo West, and he was being shifted next door. Next door. Copping a decent dose of pepper spray isn't something that wears off quickly. It can take hours, and although I initially declined the chance to go home, the supervisor soon reminds me that I don't actually have an allocated role, and I was going to be sent home anyway. Plus, to add to my elation at being sent home, he tells me that the roster is overbooked the following day and gives me that one off as well, leaving me with no shifts for the rest of the month. To think that I could have avoided a pepper spraying if I'd only hung around a bit longer at the soup's office. But then you remind yourself that the incident would have had one less person respond, and that is something that makes it worthwhile. An hour later, after writing my report as best I could, I hop in my car and drive out of the car park, my eyes still feeling on fire. The top of my head is also burning and, together with my eyes, makes the drive home less than pleasant. As if giving me a final finger for the year, the prison's pepper spray hadn't quite finished with me. Later that night, through a small brain fart, I decided to take a shower. It is only when my balls begin to burn like a son of a bitch that I remember the pepper spray still clinging to my head. A golden rule if you ever happen to receive a dose: never shower normally afterwards. Instead, wash your hair in a sink first. The spray will reactivate in water.